RTP stream directed at a destination address of your choice, right? So you can send this one little packet and get a whole bunch of data to go to any destination on the internet that you want. It's supposed to come back to you, right? It's supposed to be a transaction between you and the SIP server. But you can target someone else as the destination. And as a consequence of that, that third party is negatively impacted, and they have no way within the context of this protocol to turn that stream off. They can't tell you to stop. Negative externalities in protocol design, I believe, we can have a positive impact by addressing them in the design, as opposed to simply pushing the way we address this down to the development level. And it goes back to this model. The protocol designers want to provide as much functionality to the vendors as they can, because that's who they serve, and the vendors want to provide as much functionality to the network operators as they can. But in fact, in some of these cases, if the protocol designers stop and decide to constrain their functionality a little bit, they will have a positive impact on the security of the actual software that gets deployed in the end. So the next question I want to talk about is what's going to happen in the future with wiretapping infrastructure, and I think this is probably the most interesting part of the talk. So illegal wiretapping used to be really easy. You used to be able to go out to a telco junction box with a couple of alligator clips and hook up and listen to somebody's phone call. You could get a frequency scanner and listen to people's cellular phone calls or their cordless calls really easily. Over time, it has been getting harder. Wireless systems are maybe more likely to be spread spectrum today. Cell phones have link layer encryption. A lot of the network traffic that's actually going over the physical infrastructure it uses protocols like DSL that are not as easy to decode. You can't just hook up a little Radio Shack device and listen in. So it's becoming more difficult to do. But I don't know if we're going to achieve this ideal result where we have perfect end-to-end encryption. People don't tend to use end-to-end encryption systems that often because the actual process of authenticating them is too cumbersome. Where encryption seems to have really taken hold is when it's built into the link layer. It's invisible to the user. Everybody uses encryption on their cell phones, but they're not aware of it. It's not something that they have to bother authenticating. So if you want to reduce the amount of illegal wiretapping that happens, doing work on making link layer protocols more likely to be encrypted is going to have a positive impact on that. There are still a bunch of link layer protocols that we use that do not have any encryption in them. And there are a lot of assumptions that people make about that. Something I didn't mention, I guess, about this lawful intercept system is that one of the things you can specify in the MIB when you're provisioning the wiretap is the VPN that you want to listen to. So there's this concept of a service provider VPN, and it always kind of rubbed me the wrong way because when I think VPN, I think encryption. And most people who are out there buying VPN technology think they're buying secure links. And the service provider industry has sort of sold this concept of service provider VPNs. And they're using the same terminology, but they're not using encryption. And when you push them about it, they say, well, you don't need to worry about that because the service provider network is not subject to surveillance. Well, in fact, it is. And in fact, you can specify the specific VPN you want to listen to in the interception request. So link layer encryption is actually a really good idea. The big question is, should we build this sort of infrastructure at all? Well, law enforcement likes to wiretap suspects, and I honestly think that we're not going to reach this point where it becomes technically impossible because I don't think everyone's going to adopt end-to-end encryption. So there's always going to be a place to hook up, and if there's a place to hook up, law enforcement is going to want to do it. They can either do it with temporary or permanent infrastructure. Those are the two choices. And the consensus view of the academic security research community is that the risks involved in creating permanent infrastructure are too great. That vulnerabilities like the ones I'm talking about in this talk will be used to take control of any permanent infrastructure that you build into the system. So use temporary infrastructure instead. Use portable protocol analyzers. I think that part of the reason for this view is that they also think that creating this permanent infrastructure makes wiretapping really inexpensive. It goes back to that economic analysis I was talking about. And so more wiretapping will occur if we have it. If we have this temporary infrastructure, it's more cumbersome, and so people choose not to do a wiretap when they otherwise would. So Susan Landau and Whitfield Diffie wrote a book called Privacy on the Line, which was published about 10 years ago that talks about this subject. And Susan actually reached out to me after I did this talk at Blackhat Federal. And I started talking to her about some of the things that I'm going to tell you in a minute about what I think is going to happen in the future. And she says, I really can't talk to you about this until you read my new book. When's it coming out? Well, it's coming out in March. So she's got a new book coming out in March, and if you're interested in this subject, I suggest you read it. I'm going to read it so that I can go back and talk to her about this stuff. But not having read it, I'm going to do something radical here, and I'm going to disagree with the consensus view of the security research community, and I'm going to provide you with a different perspective, for better or for worse. And hopefully it's food for thought. I think there are arguable advantages to having permanent infrastructure. Temporary devices don't have audit trails associated with them. Somebody goes to a storeroom and they check out this protocol analyzer, and then they go do a wiretap, and hopefully they only collected the data they were authorized to collect, and then a few weeks later they check it back in, right? If you have a permanent infrastructure, then you can create checks and balances and processes associated with access control. In fact, you have to, because you have to prevent unauthorized access. There are a couple different ways to build permanent infrastructure. One approach is the way that this Cisco architecture works, where you're actually doing minimization in the router itself. You're only collecting the data that you need to collect. The other way you can do this is to scoop up everything and sort it out later. And that's exactly what the Klein Declaration describes. The Klein Declaration is this. So this guy worked for AT&T, and he went to the EFF and told them about this room that existed in one of their switching centers where there was this fiber optic splitter, and all the network traffic was being shunted off to this room where it was being analyzed by the NSA, allegedly. And so in that case, we're not carefully selecting the data we want to look at. We're taking it all. So what kind of architecture do we want to have? I think that's really the discussion we need to be having. The key difference between the Klein and Cisco architectures is the presence of human checks and balances. And I think that you could build a wiretapping infrastructure that had good human checks and balances in it, that had good audit trails, and that required the right legal authorization to use the network. And if you simultaneously coupled that with efforts to improve link layer encryption, the consequence is that you would eliminate most illegal wiretapping. Most wiretapping would be legal. It's interesting because you'd have built into this wiretapping infrastructure a system that attempts to uphold people's constitutional rights. So it's a very different view than what the consensus view of the computer security research community thinks. But I present it for you for food for thought, and I'm going to be around all weekend to potentially discuss it if you're interested. So. There's one other point I want to make, and that is that peer review is really important. This is how we build secure systems. Nobody in the world is building flawless software systems. And this conference for years has been a place where we come to discuss security vulnerabilities. And the way we do it is by looking at, through peer review, by looking at other people's technology and through a different perspective and seeing things that they haven't seen. So. What Cisco did here is they published this architecture so that we can peer review it, and that's a great thing. And it's risky to do that because somebody is going to get up at a conference and they're going to talk about their technology, and nobody likes to be criticized. But the reality is that it's through this process of criticism that we actually achieve secure systems, and you all know that. So I think Cisco should be applauded for actually providing us with this architecture to review. And I think that there's a whole bunch of other lawful intercept technology out there that's actually in our telecommunications infrastructure that has not been subject to any peer review, that does not have any public architectural diagrams. There are all these different vendors that I mentioned that make mediation devices, for example, and who's looking at that stuff to see if it's vulnerable. Yesterday, Barnaby jackpotted an ATM on stage here, and people tend to have this assumption that ATMs would be pretty secure, right? The guys who would build stuff like that would really care about building something that was as solid as possible. But in fact, when you really look at it, it turns out there are weaknesses. Well, the same thing is true of just about any kind of technical system that we've deployed. And so until somebody actually does that kind of analysis and looks at it, we can't be assured of its security. So peer review is important, and that's my talk. Thank you very much for listening to me. I hope this was interesting. And again, I'm going to be around. Sir?
In the countries that require key escrow at present, do their lawful intercepts require that you be able to decrypt the data stream?
I lost my microphone. 1 second. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong, but I don't know of any country that currently requires key escrow. It was an idea that was promoted in the United States, but I don't know if you saw Moxie's talk earlier where he talked about choice. So key disclosure is sort of a different. So no, the wiretapping infrastructure isn't set up to enforce that key disclosure. In that key disclosure case, what happens is they come and they arrest you and they compel you to give them the key. And if you don't give them the key, you sit in a jail cell until you give it to them. So that's a very human approach as opposed to a technical approach. Sir. That's right. Well, assuming they can enforce that rule, but if they start looking at your stuff and it's encrypted, then they can bust you for that. That's right.
They come back to the service provider.
Yeah.
Not the end user necessarily.
I mean, I believe that no, I haven't. I know that Cisco did read my research, and I think that it takes a long time to change some of these systems. For example, SNMP. So this guy at SNMP Research reached out to me, and they make their own custom SNMP stuff. And he said, I read your paper. Your recommendations for the SNMP protocol make a lot of sense, and we can implement them without a flag day. Do you have any customers that are demanding them? And I don't have customers that are saying we need to make these changes. I'm out talking about this because I'm trying to raise awareness about it to a certain extent. But until the phone companies actually want Cisco to make these changes, or want any other SNMP implementer to make these changes, they're not going to get made. It's their business relationship. And so all I can do is say, this is what I think. Hopefully the next time they design this, they'll consider my suggestions. But in terms of actually re-architecting this stuff in practice, it's for the vendors to decide. So let me get this question back here. Well, you'd have to establish, at least in the United States, and again, I'm not a lawyer, so ask one of the EFF people, but I think you have to establish standing, and so you've got to actually demonstrate that you were personally subject to unauthorized surveillance as a consequence of these vulnerabilities, and that's very difficult to establish. Well, the reality is that the court system won't consider your case unless you can demonstrate that you actually have meaningful harm. Go ahead. Oh, no, I don't know. I have no idea.